Welcome to Global Optimum, the podcast dedicated to making you a more effective altruist. I am Daniel Gambacorda. We're going to start off today with a groaner. What's the name of the play about a little girl who had a hard-knock life and later went on to maximize the well-being of everyone in the universe? The name of the play is Utilitarian. Ugh, I don't know about that one. This episode will feature two segments: Apply Psychology, in which I will continue my discussion of the personality of effective altruists, and Check This Rec, in which I'll provide you with a recommendation of a book, article, podcast that perhaps you are not familiar with. Let's get into it. Last episode, I talked about the personality of effective altruists. If you haven't listened to the last episode, I highly recommend you listen to it before you listen to this one. In the last episode, I put forward a few hypotheses. First, I argued that EAs may be higher than average in autistic-like traits and alexithymia. Then I went on to argue that these traits may play a causal role in attracting people to effective altruism. This episode, I'm going to continue arguing that these traits are causally important. Then I'll go on to try to explain how this personality psychology perspective I've been exploring can help us understand the EA movement as a whole. I'm going to very quickly define my terms and then get on with my wild speculations. Autistic-like traits are related to autism spectrum disorder. People who are higher in autistic-like traits are more likely to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. That said, autistic-like traits can be measured like any other personality trait. Autistic-like traits are normally distributed. Everybody falls somewhere along a continuum. Anybody can be measured for the degree to which they exhibit autistic-like traits. People who are high in autistic-like traits tend to have the following characteristics: heightened attention to detail and patterns, strong preference for routine, for example, eating the same thing every day, narrow interests, in particular, interest in music, math, and hard sciences, a tendency to engage in highly focused, repetitive activities, issues with sensory stimulation, for example, being easily bothered by sounds, restricted imagination, poor social skills, lower sex drive, and restricted sociosexuality, meaning less interest in casual sex. For the rest of this episode, just so that I don't have to use the phrase autistic-like traits over and over again, I'm going to instead say AQ. So if I'm talking about people who are high in autistic-like traits, I'll say high AQ people. The other personality construct I'm going to be referencing is alexithymia. People who are alexithymic have difficulty understanding their emotions. They have trouble distinguishing between emotions and bodily sensations, difficulty expressing emotion and describing their emotions to others. They're lower in empathy, and they have trouble identifying emotions in other people. They have a restricted imagination. They think in a more concrete, logical way, and indeed, even their dreams tend to be more logical and realistic. Alexithymic traits are normally distributed. Everyone falls somewhere on a continuum. There's a lot of overlap between autism spectrum disorder and alexithymia. Using admittedly somewhat arbitrary cutoffs, something like 50% of people with autism spectrum disorder are alexithymic. So, many people with autism spectrum disorder are alexithymic, though many are not. And some alexithymic individuals have autism spectrum disorder, though most do not. For the rest of the episode, instead of saying autism spectrum disorder over and over again, I'm going to say ASD. I will refer to people with autism spectrum disorder as ASD individuals. All right, our terms are defined. Let's theorize. In the last episode, I argued that effective altruism demands a certain kind of rationalist thinking style, and by no coincidence, ASD and high AQ people tend to have this very thinking style. Next, I'll talk moral philosophy. Effective altruism is certainly influenced by consequentialist thinking. Consequentialism is the position that morality should be thought of in terms of the consequences of our actions. Some action is ethical to the extent that it brings about desired consequences. Utilitarianism is the most widely known consequentialist theory, according to which actions are good to the extent that they maximize the amount of good in the world. Actions should be judged by how much pleasure and pain would result, and you should choose the action that, on net, maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. There's, of course, much more you can say about these theories, but this is fine for our purposes. Effective altruism is all about doing good and maximizing the amount of good that you do. You don't have to be a consequentialist to be an EA, but consequentialist thinking is clearly an important part of the ideology. One way that autistic-like traits and alexithymia may play a causal role in someone becoming an effective altruist is if these traits predispose one to make consequentialist judgments. If your personality makes you more likely to be consequentialist, it's reasonable to infer that you'll be more attracted to a consequentialist ideology like effective altruism. There's a number of studies that have investigated the connection between ASD, alexithymia, and moral judgment. These studies often employ hypothetical moral dilemmas. Participants are presented with some scenario and asked to judge which action is best from a moral point of view. Before diving into an example, I want to first say that these kinds of moral dilemmas have been criticized a fair bit, and I've cited some of these criticisms in the show notes. Despite these criticisms, I think it's plausible that the moral judgments people make in hypothetical moral dilemmas could be predictive of whether they would be attracted to a consequentialist ideology like effective altruism. This may or may not be correct, so I'll again caveat myself into oblivion and say that the arguments I'm about to present are, if anything, weak evidence for my hypothesis. Now that I've cleared my throat, let's get into one of these studies. In this study, ASD and neurotypical individuals were given trolley problems. I know there's a good chance you're familiar with trolley problems and sick of hearing about them, but you're going to hear about them one more time. For this first dilemma, participants were asked to imagine that a trolley is heading down the tracks, and there are 5 people tied to the tracks. These 5 people will die if the trolley runs them over. However, there is a switch that the participant could flip. If they flip the switch, the trolley will divert to an alternate track. There is 1 person tied to this alternate track. So, the participant has to decide. Do they do nothing, in which case the trolley will run over 5 people, or do they flip the switch, in which case the trolley will divert to the alternate track and kill only 1 person? You can say that doing nothing is a more deontological kind of response because you aren't killing an innocent person, whereas flipping the switch is the more utilitarian response because you are maximizing the number of lives saved. I'm aware that some people aren't happy with this characterization, but we are running with it. For this dilemma, the ASD individuals and neurotypicals did not significantly differ in their responses. For both groups, about 25% of them said they would not flip the switch. About 25% chose the deontological option. Moving on to the second moral dilemma. Again, there's a trolley heading down the tracks, and there are 5 people tied to the tracks. However, this time, the participant is on a footbridge overlooking the tracks. And next to the participant is a large man. The participant can push the large man onto the tracks If they do, the large man's body will stop the trolley before it reaches the 5 who are tied to the tracks, though he will be sacrificed in the process. So again, the participant is presented with 2 options. They can do nothing, in which case the 5 people tied to the tracks will die, or they can push the large man, in which case the large man will die, but the 5 who are tied to the tracks will be saved. You can say that doing nothing is the deontological option because it doesn't involve killing an innocent person, and pushing the man is the utilitarian option because it maximizes the number of lives saved. On this question, there was a significant difference between the ASD individuals and the neurotypicals. While 86% of the neurotypical group said they would do nothing, only 64% of ASD individuals said they would do nothing. So a greater proportion of the ASD individuals said they would push the innocent man to his death if it meant saving lives overall. ASD individuals were more likely to choose the utilitarian option in this case, and perhaps that says something about the way they think. As I mentioned, there's a number of studies on this, and the results are mixed. Some studies find that ASD is not related to giving more utilitarian judgments. I think there's a stronger case for alexithymia predicting utilitarian judgment. If I was a betting man, which I am, I would bet that alexithymia predicts utilitarian judgment, whereas I am less sure about ASD. Assuming there is something interesting going on here, what could explain it? Why would ASD or alexithymic individuals be more likely to choose the utilitarian option? It's thought that moral dilemmas, like the footbridge dilemma, are particularly emotionally evocative. The thought of having to push someone to their death makes people recoil. Many people who are willing to flip the switch in the first scenario are not willing to push the large man in the second scenario, even though these 2 scenarios seem largely analogous. It's been argued that the unwillingness to push the large man is driven by emotional inputs into the decision-making process, and there's plenty of evidence to that effect. Alexithymic individuals have trouble understanding and expressing their emotions. It's plausible that they make less use of emotional information when making decisions. If they're not drawing on emotional information as much when making moral decisions, it's plausible that this plays a causal role in them giving the more utilitarian judgment. Maybe ASD people are more utilitarian, but only when they are also alexithymic, which occurs only 50% of the time. The picture I'm putting forth is also consistent with the dual process model of moral decision-making advanced by the neuroscientist Joshua Green. This is essentially applying a Daniel Kahneman-style System 1, System 2 approach to moral decision-making. There are fast, automatic processes that influence moral judgment, like our emotions and gut feelings. And there are slow, deliberative processes that influence moral judgment, like reason and cost-benefit analysis. In the footbridge dilemma, the thought of pushing someone to their death produces a quick gut feeling, which may prevent us from wanting to push, whereas the deliberative part of ourselves may be motivated to maximize the number of lives saved. In the previous episode of this podcast, I argued that ASD individuals are more System 2 oriented in their thinking, and perhaps that applies to moral judgment as well. If ASD individuals are more utilitarian, perhaps it's because they rely on gut feelings less in general. Getting back to the hypothesis that certain personality traits predispose someone to become an effective altruist, the studies I've discussed are consistent with AQ and alexithymia being just such personality traits. If AQ and or alexithymia predispose you to make utilitarian judgments, it's plausible that they predispose you to be the kind of person who is attracted to a consequentialist ideology like effective altruism. And as a matter of fact, effective altruists are largely consequentialist. According to the 2017 Effective Altruism Survey, 53% of EAs lean towards utilitarianism, 13% lean towards a non-utilitarian consequentialism, 5% lean towards virtue ethics, 4% lean towards deontology, and 26% of respondents had no opinion or didn't know what these terms meant. So only considering the participants who had an opinion and knew what these terms meant, 89% of effective altruists lean towards some flavor of consequentialism. It stands to reason that the personality traits that predict consequentialist judgment could also predict involvement in EA. Next, I want to talk about empathy, because it could definitely appear as if something weird is going on here. AQ and alexithymia are both associated with low empathy. I'm arguing these traits predispose someone to become an effective altruist. Effective altruists dedicate a significant portion of their lives to altruism, helping others. How would it make sense that a low empathy group is so dedicated to helping others? I think we have to get clear on what we mean by empathy. When I say empathy, I don't mean kindness. I mean feeling what others are feeling. You flinch when you see someone else get hurt, or you feel embarrassed when you see someone else do something embarrassing. I'm also including in the definition the ability to imagine how someone would feel, and the imagining causes you to feel that way. You can have empathy for characters in a novel, even though they only exist in your head. It's often argued that empathy is a force for good. We need more empathy, and gee, the world would be a better place if we could all be more empathetic. I think this is wrong, or at least overstated. I think it's better to conceptualize empathy as a force rather than a force for good. Empathy can also motivate unethical behavior. I'm going to talk about some of the bad aspects of empathy to help make sense of why low empathy personality traits might actually be associated with effective altruism. And hopefully, I'm not trying too hard to make everything fit my theory. In one study, participants were told about a child named Sherry who had a fatal disease and was on a waiting list for a treatment that would improve her quality of life. Participants were told they were going to listen to an interview with Sherry. Right before listening to the interview, they were given the following instructions. Quote, "Try to take an objective perspective towards what is described. Try not to get caught up in how the child who is interviewed feels. Just remain objective and detached." End quote. After listening to the interview, participants were given the option of moving Sherry to the front of the waiting list, even though this would mean that another child who may be more deserving would not get the treatment. Most participants did not decide to move Sherry to the front of the list. In a second condition, before listening to the interview, participants were given the following instructions. Quote, "Try to imagine how the child who is interviewed feels about what has happened and how it has affected the child's life. Try to feel the full impact of what this child has been through and how he or she feels as a result." End quote. So essentially, participants were encouraged to empathize with Sherry. In this condition, most participants opted to bump Sherry up to the front of the waiting list. One explanation for this finding might be demand characteristics. that participants felt like they were supposed to help Sherry in the empathy condition. But if we take the study at face value, people are deciding to do something that is clearly unfair just because they empathized with one person rather than another. It's hard to justify privileging one child over another just because you spent time empathizing with that particular child. That doesn't seem like a good moral principle. So empathy, in this case, seems to be motivating unfair treatment. Empathy is also influenced by in-group bias. I think it's pretty intuitive that most people have more empathy for in-group members than out-group members, but I'll discuss one study. In this study, male soccer fans interacted with Confederates who either claimed to be a fan of the same local team or a fan of the local team's rival. We can call the Confederate who is a fan of the same team as the participant an in-group member, and the Confederate who is a fan of the rival team an out-group member. Participants received electric shocks on the back of their hand and then watched the Confederates receive the same shock. This happened while the participants were in an fMRI, which is a kind of brain scanner. It was found that there was a greater empathic neural response when the participant viewed the in-group member get shocked compared to when they viewed the out-group member get shocked, which is to say, the pattern of brain activation indicated greater empathy when the participant watched a fellow fan in pain compared to a rival fan. I'm not sure how convinced we should be that an fMRI can function as an empathy detector, but I will talk about other findings as well. In the next session of the study, participants were told that the Confederates were going to be given shocks and that the participant had three options. The participant could help the Confederate by receiving half of the shock themselves. That way the Confederate wouldn't be in so much pain. Or they could watch a soccer video, or they can watch the Confederate get shocked. It was found that the participants were more willing to help the in-group member. They were more willing to endure pain themselves to reduce the pain felt by a fellow fan, and they were more likely to choose to watch the out-group member get shocked. So they were more willing to help the in-group member and more interested in watching the out-group member feel pain. If you think that, as a first pass, all people are equally morally valuable and that your willingness to help someone shouldn't depend on them being a part of your in-group, then it seems like empathy may not be the best moral guide. Empathy will cause us to privilege our in-group in a way that doesn't seem justifiable. Empathy is also responsible for the moral bias known as the identifiable victim effect. This refers to how people are more altruistic towards a specific, identifiable person compared to a vaguely defined group with the same need. In one study, participants were told about a child dying of a disease. They were told there is a drug that can cure the disease, but $300,000 would have to be raised to produce the drug. They were then asked how much they would be willing to donate to help save the child. Participants were also given a picture of the child along with the child's name and age. In a second condition of the study, participants were told that there were 8 children dying from a disease and that $300,000 would have to be raised in order to pay for a drug that can cure all of them. They were given a picture of these children along with their ages and names, and they were asked how much they would be willing to donate. It was found that people donated more to help the single child compared to helping the 8 children. Plausibly, this is because one person triggers our empathy more strongly than a group of people. This idea is captured by the quote, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." We are moved by personal stories about identifiable individuals, and we are not so moved by hearing about groups of people. I think a core part of effective altruism that separates it from other approaches to altruism is effective altruists don't do the most empathetic thing. It's about doing the most good rather than doing what is most emotionally compelling. I think EAs would argue that helping one identifiable person instead of 8 people isn't morally justified. Caring more about identifiable victims seems like a mistake in cases where you can do a lot more good by helping groups. The idea that empathy isn't a perfect moral guide is not new. I'm discussing it in the context of making sense of why low empathy personality traits might predict effective altruism, because I think that can sound counterintuitive on its face. That said, the philosopher Peter Singer made a similar point in his 2013 book, The Most Good You Can Do. Here's a quote from that book. Singer reviews a few studies on the relationship between utilitarianism and empathy and goes on to say, quote, "If utilitarians are less prone to feel emotional empathy than others, it seems unlikely that effective altruists are dramatically different in this regard. At the very least, their altruistic actions are not likely to be the result of greater emotional empathy than people who do not act altruistically," end quote. Certainly, neither Singer nor I would claim that effective altruists are devoid of empathy, but EA doesn't seem like it's driven by high empathy. I would say that EA is driven by high compassion, defined as the capacity to care about others' welfare without necessarily feeling what they're feeling. Of course, empathy plays a role, but I think it's compassion that EAs have in abundance. Next, I'll talk about what this personality perspective can help us explain. If traits like AQ and alexithymia play some causal role in becoming an effective altruist, how can understanding that help us understand the EA movement as a whole? I'm going to draw on data from the 2018 Effective Altruism Survey and suggest that perhaps some of these survey findings can be accounted for in part by these personality variables. Of course, for each of the findings I'm going to discuss, there are going to be multiple explanations. According to the survey, the most common subject that EAs have studied is computer science, followed by math. Most EAs reported studying STEM subjects. Along the same lines, the most commonly reported field of employment, aside from other, was telecommunications, technology, internet, and electronics. Consistent with the personality perspective I've put forth, autistic-like traits are indeed correlated with having a career in a STEM field. According to the survey, effective altruism is 67% male and 29% female, so there are more than 2 males for every female in EA. Consistent with the personality perspective, men are significantly higher than women in autistic-like traits and alexithymia. Men are also more utilitarian in their moral judgments. I again emphasize that certainly there are other things at play here, just suggesting that personality might be part of the explanation. According to the survey, gender predicts which causes effective altruists think are most deserving of additional resources. Interestingly, these gender differences seem to be well predicted by differences in empathizing. Women tend to be more empathetic than men. The causes that men are more likely to prefer don't have identifiable victims. They are more abstract. Whereas the causes that women prefer tend to have identifiable victims that one can empathize with. The causes that men prefer are reducing risks from artificial intelligence, cause prioritization, meta-charities, improving rationality, pandemic preparedness, nuclear security, and existential risks aside from those already mentioned. The causes that women prefer are animal welfare, mental health, global poverty, and climate change. Now, the one cause that doesn't seem like it can be explained by greater empathy is women's preference for climate change. Climate change is mostly a future problem that doesn't have identifiable victims. I can think of a reason why women would prefer climate change, but I will avoid the temptation to add epicycles to my theory. Overall, gender differences in cause selection seem quite well predicted by empathizing. To clarify, I am not at all trying to argue that within effective altruism, the more empathetic causes are less deserving of resources. All I'm trying to do is explain individual differences in cause preferences. There you have it, a personality psychology analysis of effective altruism. I hope some of the ideas I've offered can be tested, and I hope others can build on these ideas. For now, let's head on over to check this rec. In this segment, I recommend some bit of media that you are perhaps unfamiliar with. This episode's rec is a book. The title of the book is Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, Insights from the Frontier of Evolutionary Psychiatry by Randy Nesse. In the book, Nesse tries to explain the existence of various mental illnesses using an evolutionary perspective. You can ask yourself, why has evolution left us so vulnerable to mental illness? And Nesse has some answers. He tries to explain, or at least partially explain, anxiety, depression, sexual dysfunction, anorexia, bulimia, drug addiction, schizophrenia, and autism. This is not a self-help book. It's a trade science book. That said, I think there is some self-insight to be had here. If you want to better understand mental illness, and you have a sec, check this rec. That's it for this episode. The sources that I've referred to throughout the episode, including this week's rec, can be found in the show notes. Now, go forth and make history.